And welcome back, AP Economics students. Wanted to do a short little video on the resource market as you're continuing to prepare for the AP exam. The resource market is just a small little part, and this is where, if you recall, we had Mr. Poulsen and Mr. Carlson as our guests in helping us to understand this. Now, when it comes to the resource market, you want to make sure that you recall the resource market can also be called the input market or the factor market. That's why I like to call it the RIF. They're big on synonyms in the AP. You don't want to get thrown by that. And probably they use resource and factor the most. But that's opposite the POG, the product, output, or the goods market. So if you recall, the goods market actually had four subsets. There was perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies. Well, in the RIF, there's only two. And it's perfect competition and their only version of imperfect, which is a monopoly in a labor market, which is called a monopsony. And so you just want to be familiar with these graphs. There's not nearly as much nuance to these as there is in the goods market, so they're much simpler. So I just wanted to review these real quickly, and usually what they will say, it's either going to be labor or it could be like a piece of machinery that's being used to produce products in the resource market, but wage is oftentimes the more common one. And so I'm going to start with perfect competition, and we have a labor market, and the labor market is going to produce Mr. Carlson. Just like in the perfect competition of the POG, the labor market produced Mr. Darp. Well, here the labor market's going to produce Mr. Carlson. And so in the labor market, we'll use labor. If it is labor, this will be the wage axis here. And we're trying to figure out how many people to hire. So this is the quantity of labor we're going to hire or the quantity of the resource we're going to use. And again, sometimes they'll use it could be a generator or a bulldozer, something like that. So in the marketplace, this is just going to be traditional supply and demand. And this is going to create a value here. And oftentimes a good example to be thinking of would be kind of like minimum wage, but actually if you took minimum wage out of it, if we had a humongous marketplace of unskilled workers, what would we settle on that starting wage to be? And that would produce the Mr. Carlson. So I'm going to use a straight edge here just to make sure we make a nice, easy to read graph. So out of the supply and demand, it looks like, I'm going to dot that over to here and then make it solid. Okay, and there is my Mr. Carlson. Well, the reason we call it Mr. Carlson is that it's MRC, but that stands for the marginal resource cost. Okay, the marginal resource cost. Now, depending on the year and the test, sometimes they replace R with F. So sometimes it will be the marginal factor cost. You'll see both, and just that to throw you. Well, the reason we call this Mr. Carlson is the abbreviation works, but also if you know Mr. Carlson tends to have a rather narrow band of emotional display. And so he's the same guy, happy, sad, depressed, whatever. He's just Mr. Carlson. Then we had Mr. Poulsen. Now, Mr. Poulsen looks like a normal demand curve, but in reality, there's a little bit of a hook up at the top, which you don't have to worry about. But if you remember production curves, they increase and then decrease. We had our increasing marginal returns, decreasing marginal returns, negative marginal. We had this little behavior right here with productivity. So sometimes you'll see a little bit of a hook at the beginning. It's actually the opposite of your marginal cost curve. If you know the marginal cost curve is the Nike swoosh, well, it's its opposite up here. Those mirror each other, and there's a PowerPoint early in the year that actually graphs those at the same time. As your productivity goes up, your costs on the margin go down. As your marginal productivity goes up, your marginal costs go down, and then that's how they behave. So sometimes you'll see a little hook on the front of it, but sometimes not. So we'll just draw Mr. Poulsen. Put a little tiny hook there, and that is MRP. Now the reason we call it Mr. Poulsen, it's the marginal revenue of the product. What on the margin is the revenue being produced by these people? And so by these employees or this equipment. And so the very important spot is right here. This tells you how many you're going to hire. Okay, so this part right here, I'm just going to say Q, this is the quantity H, Q sub H, just for slang there. That's the quantity we're going to hire. And you want this to be logical. So what would happen if you hired back here? What if you hired less people? Well, if you hired less people, what's going to happen is the revenue they're bringing in is greater than what they're costing you, which is good, but you can continue to hire more people. Hiring back here isn't that terrible a thing. What's really bad is hiring past this spot. Because let's say you hired right here. Well, if you hired at this spot right here, the revenue this person's bringing in on the margin is less than what they're costing you. This is really bad. So this isn't about good or bad employees. This actually goes all the way back to fixed costs, fixed resources, I should say, in your productivity. There comes a point in every business where you kind of have that sweet spot of how many people to hire. And once you go beyond that, your store or your facility is probably too small, and the people you hire don't have the ability to be productive. And so this has maximized your facility. If you've gone into a Starbucks, you've seen that many times. It doesn't matter when they're really busy. They could have 10 more people working. They'd be in each other's way. It doesn't matter. There comes a point where your diminishing marginal returns kick in, and they're going to cost you more than they're able to produce. So we're trying to shoot for this spot, and this is always the last person you hire. So they frequently give you a question here. You just have to know, and you got to listen really close or read very closely on the question. Are they asking you a question about the firm, or are they asking you a question about the marketplace? Because frequently what will happen is, let's say, just for the sake of example, we could say this is the market for welders. Okay. And for some reason, let's use somebody famous, like The Rock makes a movie, and he stars in this movie, and he's a welder, just for something silly. And all of a sudden, there's like this crazy amount of people that want to be welders because this movie had an effect on them. As silly as that sounds, back, gosh, I don't know how many years ago this was, the movie Top Gun came out with Tom Cruise. After that movie came out, the Air Force had like their best recruiting year in years because it was this really cool movie about an Air Force pilot. Huge surge in people applying. And so sometimes there's these weird things that happen where all of a sudden a career field becomes super popular. Well, if that happens, there's going to be in the marketplace a huge surge of supply of those people. And here's the unintended consequence. Because this is a labor market, when there's a big increase in supply of those laborers, look what happens to equilibrium. That increase in supply, which I don't want to draw here, but that increase in supply is going to give us an equilibrium that's lower, and it's going to pull down Mr. Carlson. And all of a sudden, people are not making as much money. That's the unintended consequence of very popular majors. If the productivity doesn't keep up and the revenue coming in doesn't keep up. So this oftentimes, as a side note, this can be a discussion regarding unskilled labor and immigration rules. And one of the issues that gets discussed in intelligence circles is, well, we have, what is our current marketplace for unskilled labor? Depending on our immigration policy, do we want more or less unskilled labor? How is that going to affect the supply right now? So I'll give you two extremes. If it's unskilled labor right now, what is our equilibrium price? And then let's say you let in, your immigration policy lets in a surge of unskilled laborers. Well, now we have a huge portion of unskilled labor, and it's even, those wages go down even further. And so, letting in or increasing that population is going to pull down a low wage even lower, which then the response to that is that's why we'd have a minimum wage to keep it from going down super low. On the flip side of this, let's go to the other extreme. We have policies with H1N1 visas about how many people can be our immigration policy in the tech industry, and we have very high-end programmers. And what are we going to do there? There's been complaints that the increase there has done the same thing. It's pulled down the average wage for tech jobs. So just something to be chewing on. There's not a right or wrong there. It's just something to be thinking about how that affects the supply of how supply is going to affect the marginal resource cost. Now, on the other side of this, let's say there's a demand all of a sudden in the marketplace for something. Let's say Oh, what's been kicked around lately is there's been a talk of maybe an infrastructure bill that gets passed, and all of a sudden we're going to need a whole bunch. Let's go back to the welders. All of a sudden we need a whole bunch of welders, but that's a demand issue. We're going to be rebuilding lots and lots of bridges, and all of a sudden, boom, we need a whole bunch of welders. Well, then the equilibrium wage for welders goes up. Maybe it'll respond with supply coming up, and then supply will come up, and the wage will go up temporarily, but then supply kicks in and it'll pull it back down. But you just want to be familiar with what happens to Mr. Carlson as this point of equilibrium changes. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. All right? Now, Mr. Paulson is not affected by what goes on in the marketplace. Mr. Paulson is only affected by what goes on in the firm. So sometimes in this firm, there's an increase or decrease in demand for workers. Maybe this firm is expanding, not the market. Maybe this firm is bought out some other firms, and or is just expanding, and they're going to hire some more workers. They have an increase in demand for some more workers. Maybe they're laying some people off. But what's going on in a firm is very independent of what's going on in the marketplace. So make sure you pay close attention to that, those questions. So I think what we'll do, maybe just to illustrate this one, maybe we'll do one shift here. So let's use the supply question here. Let's pretend there's an increase in supply in a particular marketplace, and this could have been the example of there's a surge in welders, there's a surge in unskilled labor, there's a surge in tech workers. Whatever particular marketplace we're talking about, let's do an increase in supply. So we have an increase in supply, and we'll just go through the whole process here. So there's S prime, and what does that do? Well, it kicks out a new Mr. Carlson, and it's now going to be here, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to put this up here, marginal factor cost or marginal resource cost. I'm just going to call this Mr. Carlson prime, okay, and this moved down. Okay, that's one of numerous examples you could have, and so you just want to be comfortable. Did supply increase, decrease? Would demand increase, decrease? How would this be affected? Okay. There's an example of just playing around with perfect competition. And again, on this one, if this was our new spot right here, what would happen? Well, wages would decrease, but because wages went down, you got to think like a business owner. You go, oh my gosh, I don't have to pay people as much because look what happened in the marketplace. Well, then look what happens to the quantity, though. Maybe you can actually hire more people. Your new quantity is higher because you don't have to pay as many. So just use round numbers. Let's say you were paying someone $20 an hour. Well, all of a sudden there's a huge supply of that labor. Now you only have to pay them $10 an hour. Well, now you can hire two people. Two people at $10 an hour versus one at $20, and that's part of the debate about where are those trade-offs when it comes to minimum wage as far as the number of jobs. More jobs paying lower versus less jobs paying higher, and those debates, and that's another topic for another time. Okay, so there's perfect competition in the labor or the resource market. Now, if we go over to a monopsony is going to take Mr. Carlson, and it's going to chopstick from below. And so what we usually do is this, and this is still Mr. Carlson over here, and this is the supply curve. Okay, and then Mr. Paulson hasn't changed here, and I'm going to call this MRP. Okay, and don't forget this can be a MFC as well. Okay, so it's the same idea regarding wage and quantity to hire. But what you want to do is, how do you figure out? And I should have said this was the other application of your tattoo. The most important spot here was, when does Mr. Carlson equal Mr. Paulson? That is the other application of your tattoo. It helps you figure out how many people to hire. Well, in this one right here, MRP equals MRC up here, and this is usually the only kind of question you'll get on this. And there is no firm, by the way, because it's a monopoly in a labor market, so the firm is the market. So this is how many people you hire, okay? So this is the quantity that gets hired, but the amount you pay them is right here on the supply curve. Okay, so this would be the amount paid. So I'm going to call this, this is the wage for who you hire. So MRMC gives the quantity, but this actually gives you your wage on the supply curve. Okay, now, wouldn't be surprised to see something like this. Monopsony tends to be better for like a multiple choice style question. Okay, so there is the resource market, just shown a little closer, and contrasting perfect competition monopsony. Okay, so hope your review is going well, and just wanted to emphasize a couple things from that. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.